In this week's episode of Transformers Prime, Loose Cannons, Wheeljack is back. And Jack, it was almost so cheesy that I couldn't actually get it out. And he gets the Autobots in trouble with Fowler for engaging a Decepticon out in the open in the middle of nowhere where there are no people at all. The Autobots look into it and they realize who it is and help him out. And in the process learn that the Decepticon that he was fighting is Dreadwing, the brother to Skyquake, the character who I was really disappointed that they introduced him way back in, the first proper episode of the series after the premiere and then killed him immediately. And Dreadwing does mention in this episode that he came to Earth in the first place because he and Skyquake had twin sparks, and so he could feel when Skyquake died, and Dreadwing is an interesting enough character, so I guess that does justify Skyquake getting killed off. But end of the day, while I think Dreadwing is more immediately interesting, I still think Skyquake had the greater potential as a long-running character, and so I'm still kind of bummed that he died and this is the payoff that we got. That said, Dreadwing is an interesting character with an interesting backstory. We find out that when the proper war between the Autobots and the Decepticons ended, he apparently went out into space and has been hunting down and killing ex-Wreckers, the Wreckers being the team that Wheeljack and Bulkhead were a part of. They were sort of Autobot Black Ops. They didn't really fall within the normal chain of command and didn't really respect the commanders back then, because even though I kind of thought Optimus was commander of all of the Autobots for most of the war, apparently he wasn't. Apparently there were other commanders too, and quite a few of them were cowardly. They would stand behind the front lines, allowing soldiers to fall in their place and never really getting into the thick of things. So the Wreckers didn't follow their commands by choice and took on hyper-dangerous missions that no one else would, and the implication is they kind of did this to balance things out. You had these really powerful commander characters who weren't really pulling their weight, so the Wreckers pulled it for them. And Wheeljack is particularly angry with Dreadwing because he's been doing this, and also because Wheeljack, because of Dreadwing, is kind of also sort of at fault for one of the Wreckers dying, a character called Sea Spray, who is also a character from the Generation 1 cartoon, who I would not have envisioned as a Wrecker. Dreadwing apparently put a proximity bomb on Sea Spray's ship, so when Wheeljack flew his ship too close, the bomb went off, and it was supposed to take Wheeljack with it too. It just failed to do so for one reason or another. And despite the fact that the timeline doesn't really line up, this is apparently when Dreadwing decided to head to Earth to get revenge for his brother, and so Wheeljack traced him back here. I said back in Wheeljack's introduction, when it wasn't even really Wheeljack that we were getting to know, it was that Decepticon disguised as Wheeljack, that I was pretty sure that we could gauge pretty well how Wheeljack would behave from the imposter Wheeljack, and this episode proves that. Right, he is very much that same character, though he's a lot harder on Optimus than fake Wheeljack was. He sees Optimus as a typical Autobot commander, and it's going to take some serious proving of himself on Optimus's part to change Wheeljack's mind. Thankfully, this episode gives Optimus that chance. I guess this week it was Bulkhead's turn to be really impulsive because he runs off to try to take down Dreadwing with only Wheeljack as backup at Wheeljack's behest. Maybe Bulkhead just succumbs to peer pressure really easily because he did the same thing with Bumblebee in not last week's episode, but part 1 of last week's episode. And Optimus shows up to save them when things go bad. He shows up personally and tells Wheeljack off for risking one of his people. And then when we find out that Bulkhead was taken by Dreadwing, Optimus goes with Wheeljack to rescue him. And I think it's super interesting here, the kind of dynamic we have between Wheeljack and Dreadwing. These two parallel characters, Dreadwing on one side, wanting revenge against all Autobots for Autobots killing his brother, and Wheeljack wanting revenge specifically on Dreadwing for Dreadwing killing a bunch of Wreckers, or at the very least the one Wrecker that we know for sure that he killed. Like, we know that a bunch of the other Wreckers are killed, but I don't recall Wheeljack ever giving any evidence that it was Dreadwing who killed them. Dreadwing, like his brother, is super devoted to Megatron and extremely loyal, whereas Wheeljack doesn't trust in the chain of command and therefore doesn't have a lot of respect for Optimus. And yet Dreadwing, the villain, in a lot of ways is more level-headed than Wheeljack, whereas Wheeljack is a lot more impulsive. But then at the same time, Wheeljack is far more willing to work with the other Autobots, including Optimus, when there's a need to do so, whereas Dreadwing goes without Megatron's permission to seek his revenge. This is what I was talking about Dreadwing being a more immediately interesting character. It's clear that the loyalty for Megatron is still there, but that he's letting other concerns get the best of him. Whereas Wheeljack, even though he pays lip service to not trusting or believing in Optimus, you can tell he wants to give Optimus the chance to prove himself. And Optimus does prove himself when Wheeljack and Optimus find Bulkhead rigged to one of those bombs, and it doesn't look like Wheeljack is going to be able to disarm it. Therefore, they need Dreadwing to disarm it. Optimus goes and he tries to talk Dreadwing down, kind of the same way that he tried to talk Skyquake down back when he first encountered Skyquake, but in keeping with his more proactive attitude since, like, the end of Season 1, I think. Yeah, it was when he decided to go after Megatron proactively instead of just letting him keep Megatroning. In keeping with that more proactive attitude that he's been showing since then, he tries to talk Dreadwing down, tries to convince him to abandon Megatron's cause from behind cover, and then when things go sour, he's far quicker to fight back and to fight back seriously, and eventually he and Wheeljack are able to trap Dreadwing close enough to the would-be explosion that they are able to convince Dreadwing to disable the bomb in order to save himself. And I don't entirely buy that he would do that, even though we see immediately afterwards that he had a distraction planned to ensure that he could escape after all was said and done. But then again, I kind of can buy that he would do that. Like, he really wants his revenge, but we do see he goes back to Megatron here and kind of re-pledges his loyalty to Megatron all over again for the second time in this episode. So it kind of comes off like he realized if he dies for this vendetta, he won't be able to serve Megatron, and so at the end, his loyalty won out. And at the same time, Optimus has proven himself to Wheeljack, so Wheeljack decides to scan an Earth mode and stay on Earth. Not at base with everybody else, but he is going to be roaming the planet and on call should they need him. As a one-off episode, I like this a lot. I like Wheeljack's character. Dreadwing, I've already said, is interesting. And I do like that the cast of the show has been expanded by 2 full characters now because of this. They introduced another character who is interesting in similar ways to Skyquake, and they didn't kill him off this time. And we have a whole new Autobot added to the bunch. At least, sort of. Wheeljack's dynamic with Optimus is really interesting, especially considering his history with other Autobot leaders, and his dynamic with Bulkhead is just, it's great. I love it a lot. And as weird as it sounds, I also like this episode a lot for the fact that the other characters are hardly in it. Like, if I didn't mention a character here in this review, it's because they either didn't do anything in this episode or did so little that it didn't matter. Like, I mentioned Megatron offhand in that Dreadwing, like, re-pledged his loyalty to Megatron twice, but Megatron himself didn't really do anything. I think Ratchet had a line, I think RC might have had a line, but they didn't do anything. And it's because of that and because of a couple other things that this struck me as an animated version of a bottle show, an episode of television made on a very strict budget to save money for other, more expensive projects elsewhere in the season. Like, Dreadwing gets an Earth mode earlier in the episode, but it's the exact same Earth mode that his brother got from scanning Fowler's exact same jet, which is a reused asset obviously. The first fight between the Autobots and Dreadwing took place out in the middle of the desert, next to the literal exact same gas station that we see in like every third episode, which are of course reused assets. The second fight between Wheeljack and Dreadwing took place in like a canyony area, and the final fight took place in this area filled with a bunch of large shipping containers, which not only blocked out the backgrounds most of the time, but were super repetitive and were probably a cinch to animate compared to some of the landscapes in this show, while still offering a tight claustrophobic setting in which this fight could occur. Other than that, the only settings in this episode were the Autobot base and the bridge of the Nemesis. Everything in this is an asset that could have easily been pulled from elsewhere in the series, and you didn't even have to animate all of the characters, because most of them were barely involved in the story at all. And because of that, this ends up being a far more personal story. You get a lot of personal moments between Wheeljack and Bulkhead, and a lot of personal moments between Wheeljack and Optimus, and even some good moments of, I guess I would say, self-reflection from Dreadwing. It ends up being about those four characters and nothing else, excluding everything else to ensure that it remains on focus. That said, though, the action in this was not as spectacular as the action in Prime often is. It was mostly a lot of characters blasting at each other and bombs going off, but still it was fine. As a one-off sort of break after the 3-part season premiere and then the 2-parter that followed, this worked exactly as well as I think the writers and the animators and the producers and all the rest of the crew on the show expected that it would. And I don't really have anything negative to say about it. All of that said, though, guys, what did you think of Loose Cannons? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.